The elevator lurched to a grinding halt between the 32nd and 33rd floors of the Meridian Corporate Tower. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the polished steel walls as the ventilation system wheezed to a stop. Inside, 8 people stood frozen in the sudden darkness, their morning coffee growing cold as reality set in. They were trapped. Among them, Margaret Chun, CEO of Meridian International, pressed the emergency button repeatedly, her jaw clenched tight. The company's most critical board meeting was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Investors from 3 continents were waiting in the conference room above, ready to hear her presentation that would determine whether Meridian's expansion into Southeast Asian markets would receive the $2 billion in funding they desperately needed. 20 years of building her empire. 20 years of fighting for respect in boardrooms filled with men who questioned every decision she made. And now, on the most important day of her career, she was stuck in a metal box with a broken speaker system and no way to communicate with the outside world. Margaret pulled out her phone. No signal. She tried again, moving to different corners of the elevator. Nothing. The other passengers began to murmur anxiously, their voices creating a low hum of growing panic. A businessman in expensive suit started pacing the small space. An elderly woman clutched her purse tighter. A delivery worker banged on the doors, shouting for help. But Margaret remained silent. She had learned long ago that in moments of crisis, showing fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her reputation as the Iron Lady of international commerce hadn't been earned through displays of vulnerability. She stood perfectly still, her mind racing through contingency plans, backup presentations, alternative routes to the boardroom. None of them would work if she couldn't get out of this elevator. The minutes ticked by. 5, 10, 15. Assistant would be fielding questions from increasingly impatient investors. Her CFO would be making excuses. Her competitors would be watching, waiting for any sign of weakness they could exploit. That's when she heard it. A soft voice, barely above a whisper, speaking what sounded like Mandarin. Margaret turned toward the sound and saw a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, sitting cross-legged in the corner of the elevator. She wore a faded denim jacket over a simple white dress, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or privilege, yet there was something in her eyes that caught Margaret's attention. Intelligence, determination, and something else she couldn't quite identify. The girl was speaking into what appeared to be a small handheld radio, the kind construction workers or security guards might use. Her voice was calm, measured, professional despite her age. She switched languages mid-sentence, flowing seamlessly. From Mandarin to what Margaret recognized as Thai, then to Vietnamese. Who is this child? Margaret thought. And how does she have communication when none of our phones work? Before she could ask, the girl looked up and met her eyes. Without breaking contact, she switched to English, but continued speaking. Into the radio. Yes, I understand the situation, the girl said, her accent barely detectable. The elevator is stuck between floors 32 and 33. 8 passengers total. One appears to be in a business suit, clearly agitated about time constraints. Margaret's eyebrows rose. The girl was describing her. Tell maintenance the emergency communication system is functioning on backup power, but the main power coupling needs manual reset from the mechanical room. The passengers are safe, but one appears to have an urgent appointment. The girl paused, listening to a response that Margaret couldn't hear clearly through the small speaker. Then she switched to what sounded like Spanish, speaking rapidly and with apparent fluency. After a moment, she returned to English. They're asking if anyone needs medical attention or has claustrophobia issues. Also, they want to know if someone named Margaret Cheen is in this elevator. Every eye in the fuzzy small space turned to Margaret. She felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral. "I'm Margaret Chen," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. The girl nodded and spoke into the radio again, this time in what Margaret was certain was Korean. The exchange lasted nearly a minute before the girl turned back to her. "Mrs. Chun, they know about your meeting. Your assistant contacted building security when you didn't arrive. The maintenance team is prioritizing this elevator, but they estimate 20 to 30 minutes for repair." Margaret felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. 30 minutes would mean missing the opening of the most important presentation of her career. 30 minutes would mean watching $2 billion in funding slip away. Because she was trapped in a broken elevator. 20 to 30 minutes is unacceptable, Margaret said, her voice sharp. There has to be another option. The girl studied her for a moment, then spoke into the radio again. This time she used all 5 languages in rapid succession, as if consulting with different people or departments. Margaret watched, fascinated despite her frustration, as the child conducted what appeared to be a complex multilingual negotiation. "There is another option," the girl finally said. "But it's not standard protocol. What is it?" "They can manually operate the elevator from the 33rd floor, but someone needs to communicate the exact positioning from inside the elevator. The problem is that the person operating the manual controls speaks only Tagalog, and the building's translator isn't available today." Margaret stared at her. "You speak Tagalog?" "Among other languages," the girl replied simply. "But there's a risk. If the communication isn't perfect, if there's any misunderstanding about positioning or timing, the elevator could drop or get wedged permanently." The other passengers had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. The businessman stepped forward. "Look, kid, I don't know who you are or how you got that radio, but this is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Surely there are proper channels, official procedures." "The proper channels," the girl interrupted quietly, "are what got us stuck here in the first place." Margaret found herself studying the child more carefully. There was something about her manner, her confidence, that seemed far beyond her years. She spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, despite her obvious youth. "What's your name?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret asked. "Sofia Rodriguez," the girl replied. "And before you ask, I'm here with my father. He's doing maintenance work on the 25th floor. And the radio?" Sofia held up the device. "Building maintenance frequency. Most workers have them, but the main communication system routes through different channels depending on which department you need. Engineering speaks Korean. IT support speaks Mandarin. The manual elevator operators speak Tagalog. The emergency coordinators speak Thai and Vietnamese." Margaret blinked. "You're telling me this building's emergency communication system requires 5 different languages?" "Meridian International employs people from 17 countries," Sofia said, matter-of-factly. "Most speak English as a second or third language, but in crisis situations, people default to their native language. It's more precise, less chance for dangerous misunderstandings." The businessman scoffed. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Why doesn't management require English proficiency?" Sofia's eyes hardened slightly. "Because people who speak multiple languages are often more skilled at their jobs than people who speak only one. My father, for instance, can repair elevator systems that English-speaking technicians have given up on. But when he needs to describe complex mechanical problems quickly and accurately, he uses Spanish." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Here was a 12-year-old girl explaining international workforce dynamics with more clarity than most of her executive team could manage. "Sofia, she said slowly. "If you can help get this elevator moving, I'll make sure your father's supervisor knows how valuable his daughter is." Sophia shook her head. "I don't want anything for my father, but I might want something for myself." The elevator fell silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Margaret found herself looking at this child with new eyes. In 20 years of business, she had learned to recognize ambition, intelligence, and opportunity. Usually, she encountered these qualities in conference rooms and corner offices, wielded by people in expensive suits with impressive degrees. She had never encountered them in a 12-year-old sitting on the floor of a broken elevator. "What do you want?" Margaret asked. Sofia Rodriguez stood up, brushing off her simple dress, and looked directly into the eyes of one of the most powerful women in international business. "I want you to listen," she said simply. "Really listen. Not just to me, but to what I have to say about this company, this building, and the people who work in it. People you've never noticed, but who keep everything running." Margaret felt her breath catch. This child was negotiating with her. Actually negotiating, with confidence and clarity that would have impressed her in a Harvard MBA graduate. "All right," Margaret said carefully. "I'm listening." Sofia raised the radio and spoke in rapid Tagalog. The response came back immediately, and she switched to Korean, then Thai, then back to English. "They're ready to attempt manual operation," she announced to the elevator. "Everyone needs to stand back from the doors and hold onto the handrail. Mrs. Chun, you might want to prepare yourself. In about 5 minutes, you're either going to make your meeting, or we're all going to have a very different kind of conversation with building management." As Sofia began coordinating the complex multilingual operation that would either save Margaret's crucial presentation or trap them all permanently, Margaret realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Because she was beginning to understand that the most important conversation of her career might not be happening in the boardroom 33 floors above. It might be happening right here with a 12-year-old girl who spoke 5 languages and saw the world in ways that Margaret had never considered. The radio crackled to life, and Sophia's voice filled the elevator, switching between languages with the fluid grace of someone born to build bridges between worlds. And Margaret Chun, for the first time in 20 years, found herself truly listening. 3 months before the elevator incident, Sofia Rodriguez had been sitting in the back row of Lincoln Elementary's parent-teacher conference night, watching her father Miguel shift uncomfortably in a plastic chair that seemed too small for his broad shoulders. His work uniform, a navy blue jumpsuit with Meridian Building Services embroidered on the pocket, was clean but showed the permanent stains that came from years of honest labor. His hands, calloused from handling tools and machinery, rested nervously on his knees as he listened to Mrs. Patterson, Sophia's teacher, deliver what had become a familiar refrain. "Sophia is brilliant," Mrs. Patterson said, glancing between Miguel and the stack of test papers on her desk. "Her standardized scores are off the charts. She completed this 6th grade math curriculum in September. She's reading at a high school level, but..." Miguel's shoulders tensed. There was always a but when teachers talked about Sofia. "She doesn't participate in group activities. She prefers to work alone. During recess, she sits by herself with those language books instead of playing with other children. I'm concerned about her social development." Sofia watched her father's face carefully. She could read the emotions there as clearly as she could read the 5 languages that filled her notebooks: worry, pride, frustration, love, and underneath it all, the quiet fear that he wasn't enough for a daughter whose mind worked in ways he couldn't fully understand. "She talks to people," Miguel said quietly, his English careful and deliberate. "Maybe not children her age, but she talks to everyone in our apartment building. Mrs. Kim on the 3rd floor, Mr. Patel who runs the grocery store, the mailman who only speaks Portuguese. She helps them understand each other." Mrs. Patterson nodded politely, the way adults do when they're listening but not really hearing. That's wonderful, Mr. Rodriguez, but Sophia needs to develop relationships with her peers. Perhaps she could join some after-school activities. Soccer? Art club? Sophia had heard this conversation before, in different classrooms with different teachers. They all saw the same thing, a girl who didn't fit the expected mold, who was somehow both too advanced and too isolated. What they didn't see was the world Sophia had built for herself, a world where language was a bridge rather than a barrier, where being different wasn't a problem to be solved. After the conference, as they walked through the darkened hallways, toward the exit, Miguel finally spoke. "Mia, are you unhappy at school?" Sophia considered the question seriously. Her father never asked casual questions. Every word he spoke was measured, important. "I'm not unhappy," she said finally. "I'm just waiting." "For what?" Sophia paused at the large window overlooking the school parking lot. In the distance, she could see the lights of downtown, including the towering Meridian building where her father worked overnight shifts maintaining the complex systems that kept 33 floors of offices running smoothly. "For someone to need what I can do," she said simply. Miguel knelt down to her level, his work boots squeaking slightly on the polished floor. "What you can do is special, Sophia. But special doesn't always mean easy." Sophia nodded. She had learned this lesson early. When she was 7, she had overheard Mrs. Chun in apartment 4B crying on the phone because she couldn't understand the medical bills that kept arriving in English. Sophia had knocked on her door and offered to translate. Mrs. Chun had been so grateful that she'd cried again, this time with relief. When she was 9, she had helped Mr. Ahmed navigate the complex bureaucracy of getting his son enrolled in school by translating documents from English to Arabic and back again. The school administrators had been suspicious of a child doing the translating until Sophia had calmly explained each form, answered their questions, and demonstrated an understanding of educational policy that impressed even the principal. But these victories were invisible to her teachers, who saw only girl who didn't play kickball at recess. "Papa," Sophia said as they reached their old Honda in the parking lot, "why do you work at night?" Miguel started the engine, which turned over with a reluctant cough. "Because that's when they need maintenance workers. During the day, the building is full of important people doing important business. At night, it's just us. The people who actually keep everything running." Miguel glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "How do you know about that?" Sophia smiled. "Because I listen. When you come home in the morning, you tell me about the problems you fixed. The elevator that wouldn't stop on the right floor. The air conditioning system that was making noise. The computer servers that were overheating. You never just fix one thing. You have to understand how everything connects." "That's right," Miguel said, pride evident in his voice. "Everything connects. The people connect too," Sophia continued. "That's why they speak different languages. Not because they can't learn English, but because they think in their first language. When Mr. Park explains a computer problem in Korean, he's more precise than when he struggles with English words that don't quite mean the same thing." Miguel pulled into their apartment complex parking lot and turned off the engine. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. "Mia," he said finally, "you see things other people don't see." "Is that bad?" "No," Miguel said firmly. "It's necessary. The world needs people who can see the connections." That night, as Sophia lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of their apartment building settling into sleep, she had made a decision. She would start paying closer attention to her father's work. Not just the stories he told, but the patterns underneath them. She began accompanying him to the Meridian building on weekends when he picked up extra shifts. While Miguel worked on mechanical systems, Sophia explored the building with the careful attention of someone studying a complex organism. She learned which elevators had subtle timing issues. She figured out which floors had temperature control problems. She memorized the locations of emergency communication systems and backup power supplies. More importantly, she learned about the people who worked there, the night cleaning crew who spoke Spanish and Tagalog, the security guards who communicated in a mixture of English and Korean, the IT technicians who defaulted to Mandarin when discussing complex problems, the facilities coordinators who grew up speaking Thai and Vietnamese. Sophia discovered that the Meridian building was like a small city with its own culture, its own unspoken rules, and its own communication challenges. During the day, when the executives and managers were present, everyone spoke careful English and followed official protocols. But at night, when the real work got done, people reverted to their natural languages and informal systems that actually worked. She also learned about Margaret Chun, not personally, but through observation and overheard conversations. Sophia knew that Margaret arrived every morning at exactly 7:30, always carrying a large coffee and a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Miguel made in a month. She knew that Margaret stayed later than almost anyone else, often working until the night maintenance crew arrived. She knew that Margaret's assistant, a nervous young man named David, spent most of his time fielding calls from people who wanted access to Margaret but couldn't get it. What Sophia found most interesting was that Margaret seemed completely unaware of the complex ecosystem that surrounded her. She moved through the building like someone traveling in a bubble, protected from the daily realities that kept her world functioning. She never spoke to the maintenance workers, never acknowledged the cleaning crew, never seemed to notice that her pristine office environment existed because dozens of people worked invisible jobs to maintain it. Sophia didn't judge Margaret for this. She understood that people lived in different worlds, even when they occupied the same physical space. But she also recognized that this separation created vulnerabilities. When systems failed, when communication broke down, when emergencies arose, the people who actually understood how things worked were often the last ones consulted. On the morning of the elevator incident, Sophia had been in the building earlier than usual. Miguel had been called in to investigate a recurring problem with the elevator system, something that had been happening intermittently for weeks, but never when the regular repair crews were available to diagnose it. Sophia had watched him work, noting how he listened to the subtle sounds of the machinery, how he traced electrical connections with his fingers, how he consulted with other workers in their shared languages to piece together a complete picture of the problem. It's not mechanical, Miguel had concluded after 2 hours of investigation. It's communication. The elevator control system is trying to talk to the building's main computer, but there's a translation error in the software. Like when someone speaks English words but with Spanish grammar. It sounds almost right, but the meaning gets lost. Sophia had found this fascinating. Even machines, apparently, could have language problems. When Miguel finished his shift at 6 in the morning, Sophia had asked to stay in the building. She wanted to observe the elevator during peak usage hours to see if the communication errors followed predictable patterns. Absolutely not, Miguel had said immediately. This is a workplace, not a playground. But Sophia had persisted with the quiet determination that her father knew meant she had already made up her mind. She promised to stay out of the way, to avoid the executive floors, to be invisible. She reminded him that she had building visitor credentials because of his employee status. She pointed out that understanding the problem better might help him solve it more effectively. Finally, reluctantly, Miguel had agreed, with the understanding that Sophia would meet him in the lobby at 4 o'clock and that she would call him immediately if anything went wrong. Sophia had spent the morning in the building's lower levels, observing patterns and taking notes. She had discovered that the elevator problems always occurred when the system was under stress, when multiple cars were being called simultaneously, when the building's main computer had to coordinate complex scheduling. By noon, she had identified what she believed was the source of the communication error. The elevator control system had been installed by a Korean company, programmed by Chinese technicians, and modified by Filipino engineers. The error messages were being translated through multiple languages before reaching the central computer. And something was getting lost in translation. Sophia had been making her way to the maintenance office to share this information with her father, when the elevator doors had opened on the 32nd floor, and she had stepped inside, just as Margaret Chun and 7 other passengers entered. She had brought the maintenance radio because she had been using it all morning to coordinate with her father and other workers. She had learned to operate it during previous visits to the building, and the maintenance staff had grown accustomed to hearing her voice on their frequency. What Sophia hadn't expected was to find herself trapped in an elevator with the CEO of Meridian International at the most critical moment of Margaret's career. But as she looked at Margaret's carefully composed face and heard the barely controlled tension in her voice, Sophia realized that this might be exactly the opportunity she had been waiting for. Not to show off her language skills or to prove how smart she was, but to demonstrate something far more important. She could show Margaret Chen what happened when different worlds collided, when the invisible people who kept everything running were finally given a voice, when communication became a bridge instead of a barrier. Sophia raised the radio and began to speak, knowing that in the next few minutes, she would either save Margaret's crucial presentation or change both of their lives forever. The elevator shuddered slightly as the manual override system engaged, and Sophia's voice filled the small space with the fluid sounds of 5 languages working together to solve a problem that English alone could not address. Margaret Chun watched this 12-year-old girl coordinate a complex technical operation with the precision of a seasoned executive, and for the first time in her career, she began to understand that the most important lessons about leadership might come from the most unexpected teachers. The elevator lurched upward 6 inches, then stopped with a metallic groan that made everyone grab the handrails. Sophia's voice remained steady as she spoke rapid Tagalog into the radio, her tone carrying the authority of someone translating life or death instructions. Margaret watched, fascinated despite her mounting anxiety, as this child switched between languages with the fluidity of water flowing around obstacles. Each language seemed to unlock different information, different solutions, different perspectives on the same mechanical problem. "Tell them to hold position," Sophia said in English, then immediately switched to Korean. The response came back in a torrent of words that Margaret couldn't understand, but Sophia's face showed she was processing complex technical information. "There's a secondary issue," Sophia announced to the elevator passengers. "The manual override is working, but there's a software conflict between the elevator's original programming and the building's newer security system. They're fighting each other." The businessman who had been pacing earlier stepped forward aggressively. "Look, I don't care what the problem is. Just get us out of here. I have a plane to catch." Sophia looked at him with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with adults who didn't understand the complexity of the situation. "Sir, if they force the elevator to move without resolving the software conflict, we could get stuck between floors permanently. Or worse, the safety systems could fail completely." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. How much worse? "The elevator could drop," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "It's unlikely, but possible if the brake systems receive conflicting commands." Silence fell over the small space. Margaret realized that this 12-year-old girl was making decisions that could literally mean the difference between life and death for 8 people. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, Margaret found herself oddly reassured by Sophia's calm competence. "What do you recommend?" Margaret asked. Sophia raised the radio again and launched into what sounded like a 4-way conversation, involving Korean, Mandarin, Thai, and Spanish. Margaret could pick out occasional English words scattered throughout the rapid-fire exchange, but the majority of the communication was incomprehensible to her. After several minutes, Sophia lowered the radio and turned to Margaret. "There are two options," she said. "The safe option takes 45 minutes. They shut down the building's main computer system, reset all the elevator programming, and manually extract us using standard emergency procedures." Margaret's heart sank. 45 minutes would mean missing not just the opening of her presentation, but the entire first session. By the time she reached the boardroom, the investors would have moved on to other agenda items. The window for her proposal would have closed. "What's the second option?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "The risky option takes 10 minutes, Sophia said. I coordinate directly with the technicians to override the software conflict manually. It requires precise timing and perfect communication between 5 different departments. If anyone misunderstands anything, if there's any delay or confusion." In translation, "We could fall," Margaret finished. Sophia nodded, "or get permanently stuck. But if it works, you'll make your meeting with time to spare." Margaret stared at this child who was calmly offering to risk her life to save a business presentation. The rational part of her mind screamed that no corporate deal was worth endangering 8 people, especially a 12-year-old girl, but the part of her mind that had built Meridian International from a small import business into a global corporation recognized something else: opportunity. Not just the opportunity to save her presentation, but the opportunity to witness something extraordinary. "Sophia," Margaret said carefully, "why are you willing to take this risk for someone you've never met?" Sophia considered the question with the seriousness she seemed to bring to everything. "Because," she said finally, "this isn't really about your meeting. This is about whether the people who actually understand how things work get listened to, or whether they stay invisible forever." The elderly woman who had been clutching her purse spoke up for the first time. "Sweetheart, that's very noble, but this is awfully dangerous for a philosophical point." Sophia turned to her with respectful attention. "Ma'am, my father has been working in this building for 3 years. In that time, he's identified dozens of problems that could have caused serious accidents or system failures. He's reported them, all through proper channels. None of them have been fixed because the people who make decisions never talk to the people who do the work." She gestured toward the radio. "Right now, there are 5 maintenance workers who know exactly how to solve this problem safely and quickly. But they can't implement the solution because they're not authorized to make decisions, and the people who are authorized don't speak their languages." Margaret felt something shift in her understanding. "You're saying this elevator problem is a metaphor." "I'm saying this elevator problem is exactly what happens when companies prioritize hierarchy over communication," Sophia replied. "The Korean technician who installed this system left detailed notes about potential software conflicts. But those notes were written in Korean and no one bothered to translate them properly. The Chinese programmer who modified the code knew there would be integration issues, but she wasn't allowed to speak directly to the installation team. The Filipino engineers who did the final calibration warned about timing problems, but their reports got buried in bureaucracy." Sophia's voice grew more passionate as she continued. "Everyone who actually touches this system knew there would be problems. But the information never reached the people who could authorize solutions, because there's no real communication between the different levels of the company." Margaret found herself staring at Sophia with growing amazement. This child had just delivered a more insightful analysis of corporate dysfunction than most of her senior executives could manage. "How do you know all this?" Margaret asked. "Because I listen," Sophia said simply. "When my father comes home from work, he tells me about his day. Not just what he fixed, but what he couldn't fix and why. When I'm in this building, I pay attention to how people communicate, who talks to who gets heard and who gets ignored." The delivery worker who had been banging on the doors earlier spoke up. "Kid's right. I've been delivering to this building for 5 years. I see things. I hear things. Half the problems that shut down operations could be prevented if someone would just ask the maintenance crew what they think. Sophia nodded at him gratefully, then turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Chun, you built this company by seeing opportunities other people missed. Right now, you have an opportunity to see your own organization from a completely different perspective. Margaret felt her phone buzz and automatically reached for it before remembering there was no signal. The reflex reminded her that somewhere above them, her assistant was fielding increasingly urgent questions from investors who had flown in from 3 continents specifically to hear her presentation. But for the first time in years, Margaret found herself more interested in the conversation happening right in front of her than in the business deal waiting 33 floors above. Tell me about the risky option, she said. Exactly what would it involve? Sophia raised the radio and spoke briefly in Korean. The response was immediate and detailed. She then switched to Mandarin, had a shorter exchange, and finished with rapid Spanish. Here's what has to happen, Sophia said. The Korean technician needs to bypass the security integration protocol at exactly the same moment that the Chinese programmer resets the elevator's positioning system. Meanwhile, the Tagalog-speaking operator has to manually control the physical movement while the Thai coordinator manages power distribution and the Vietnamese supervisor monitors safety systems. Margaret blinked. All simultaneously? Within a 3-second window, Sophia confirmed. And I need to coordinate all of it because I'm the only person in the building right now who can communicate with all 5 departments in real time. The businessman laughed nervously. This is insane. We're talking about putting our lives in the hands of a child. Sophia looked at him steadily. Sir, you put your life in the hands of children every day. The young woman who programmed the navigation system in your car. The recent engineering graduate who designed the airplane you fly in. The 20-something technician who maintains the elevator in your apartment building. Age doesn't determine competence. Margaret found herself nodding. She's right. The question isn't whether Sophia is old enough to coordinate this operation. The question is whether she's qualified. How do we determine that? The elderly woman asked. Sophia spoke into the radio again, this time cycling through all 5 languages in rapid succession. The responses came back immediately, overlapping and urgent sounding. They're asking the same question, Sophia said. The technicians want to know if I'm qualified to coordinate a complex manual override operation. She paused, looking around the elevator at 8 adults who were waiting for a 12-year-old girl to decide their fate. Here's how we find out, Sophia said. I'm going to walk them through a test sequence. If I can successfully coordinate a minor adjustment to the elevator's position, if all 5 departments confirm that my instructions are clear and accurate, then we proceed with the full operation. If there's any confusion, any miscommunication, any indication that I'm not qualified, we go with the safe option. Margaret realized she was holding her breath. And if the test works? Sophia smiled for the first time since the elevator had stopped. Then you make your meeting. I prove that language barriers are solvable problems, and 8 people learn something important about trusting unexpected expertise. Margaret looked around the elevator. The businessman was checking his watch anxiously. The elderly woman was gripping her purse, but nodding slowly. The delivery worker was grinning with anticipation. The other passengers were watching Sophia with expressions ranging from fear to fascination. All in favor of the test? Margaret asked. 7 hands rose into the air. Only the businessman hesitated, then slowly raised his hand as well. Sophia lifted the radio and began speaking in Korean. Her voice carried a new quality now, the confidence of someone who had been given permission to demonstrate what she could really do. The test began, and Margaret realized that regardless of whether they made it out of this elevator safely, her life had already changed completely. because she had just watched a 12-year-old girl take command of a crisis situation with more skill and composure than most of her senior executives possessed. And she was beginning to understand that everything she thought she knew about leadership, communication, and corporate structure was about to be challenged by someone who saw the world through entirely different eyes. Sophia's test coordination had worked flawlessly. The elevator had moved precisely 18 inches upward, stopped smoothly, and returned to its original position with mechanical precision that impressed even the skeptical businessman. More importantly, all 5 departments had confirmed that Sophia's instructions were not only clear but more detailed and accurate than the standard protocol manuals. Now, as Sophia prepared for the full operation, Margaret found herself experiencing something she hadn't felt in years: complete dependence on someone else's expertise. "Beginning primary sequence," Sophia announced, her voice carrying through the elevator with calm authority. She spoke first in Korean, a lengthy exchange that involved what sounded like complex technical specifications. The response was immediate and confident. Margaret watched Sophia's face as she listened to the Korean technician's reply. The girl's expression showed intense concentration, but no fear. She was processing information at a speed that Margaret found remarkable, translating not just words but concepts across multiple technical disciplines and cultural contexts. Sophia switched to Mandarin, her tone becoming more rapid and precise. The Chinese programmer's voice crackled through the radio speaker, and Margaret could hear keyboards clicking in the background. Sophia responded with a series of numbers and technical terms, then switched immediately to Spanish. The conversation in Spanish was different, more collaborative and detailed. Sophia was clearly working with someone who understood both the mechanical and software aspects of the operation. Margaret realized she was witnessing not just translation, but real-time technical consultation across language barriers. "Position confirmed," Sophia announced in English. "Power distribution ready. Beginning final synchronization sequence." She switched to Thai, and Margaret could hear multiple voices responding. The coordination was becoming more complex, with overlapping conversations and rapid confirmations. Sophia managed it all with the fluid competence of an air traffic controller handling multiple flights in dangerous weather. Finally, Sophia spoke in Tagalog, her voice taking on an almost musical quality as she guided the manual operator through the precise movements required. Margaret could feel the elevator responding, tiny adjustments in position and tension that spoke of human hands working in perfect coordination with electronic systems. 30 seconds, Sophia announced. "Everyone hold tight." The elevator began to move, not with the usual smooth electronic precision, but with the careful deliberation of a complex mechanical operation being performed by skilled hands. Margaret felt her stomach drop slightly as they passed through what must have been the problematic zone between floors 32 and 33. For a moment, the elevator shuddered and Margaret's heart skipped. But Sophia's voice continued, steadily, cycling through languages, making tiny adjustments, keeping 5 different departments coordinated in real time. Then, with a soft chime that sounded like a miracle, the elevator doors opened on the 33rd floor. The relief in the small space was palpable. The businessman immediately rushed out, muttering thanks over his shoulder. The elderly woman paused to pat Sophia's arm gently before departing. The delivery worker grinned and gave Sophia a thumbs up. Margaret stepped out of the elevator, then turned back to Sophia, who was still speaking into the radio, apparently coordinating the post-operation shutdown sequence. "Sophia," Margaret said quietly. The girl looked up, her professional demeanor finally showing a hint of the 12-year-old underneath. "You saved my presentation," Margaret said. "But more than that, you showed me something I've never seen before." Sophia tilted her head questioningly. "You showed me what my company actually looks like from the inside," Margaret continued. "All these years, I thought I was running a smooth operation. I had no idea how much dysfunction I was missing. Sophia finished her radio conversation and stepped out of the elevator. Mrs. Chun, your company isn't dysfunctional. It's just structured in a way that makes certain problems invisible to the people who could solve them. Margaret checked her watch. She had exactly 8 minutes to reach the boardroom, review her presentation notes, and deliver the most important pitch of her career. But instead of rushing away, she found herself wanting to continue this conversation. Sophia, what you did just now, coordinating that operation that required skills that most of my executives don't have. Where did you learn to do that? Sophia shrugged. I didn't learn it anywhere. I just pay attention to how communication really works instead of how it's supposed to work. What do you mean? Sophia gestured toward the elevator they had just exited. Your company has official procedures for everything. But the official procedures assume that everyone speaks the same language, understands the same context, and has the same priorities. In reality, people work around the official procedures all the time because the official procedures don't actually work. Margaret felt a familiar sensation, the same feeling she got when examining financial reports and discovering a pattern that revealed hidden opportunities or threats. Give me an example, she said. The overnight cleaning crew, Sophia said immediately. According to the official schedule, they clean each floor in a specific sequence designed for maximum efficiency. But in reality, they clean around the equipment that my father and other technicians are repairing. They have an informal communication system that lets them coordinate in real time, switching between Tagalog and Spanish depending on which crew is working which floor. Margaret frowned. That sounds like it would create inefficiencies. Actually, it prevents them, Sophia said. The official schedule doesn't account for maintenance work, emergency repairs, or equipment that needs to stay online overnight. If the cleaning crew followed the official procedures exactly, they would interfere with critical maintenance and cause system failures. Margaret felt something click into place in her mind. You're saying the informal systems are more effective than the formal ones. I'm saying the informal systems are what make the formal ones possible, Sophia corrected. Your executives see smooth operations and assume the official procedures are working. But smooth operations happen because people like my father and the cleaning crew and the security staff constantly adapt the official procedures to reality. Margaret glanced at her watch again. 6 minutes. But this conversation was revealing structural problems in her organization that could affect far more than one presentation. Sophia, if what you're saying is true, then I've been managing blindly for years. Not blindly, Sophia said gently. You've been managing from a distance. There's a difference. How do I close that distance? Sophia looked at her seriously. You listen. Not to reports about what's happening, but to the actual people making things happen. And you learn enough of their languages, literal and figurative, to understand what they're really telling you. Margaret realized that David, her assistant, was probably pacing frantically in the boardroom, fielding questions from increasingly impatient investors. She needed to go, but she also needed to finish this conversation. Sophia, I want to hire you, she said impulsively. Sophia blinked. I'm 12 years old. As a consultant, Margaret clarified quickly. I want you to teach me what you just taught me. I want you to show me how communication really works in my company, as opposed to how I think it works. Sophia considered this seriously. What about school? Margaret felt her phone buzz, and this time actually had signal. Multiple urgent messages from David, from board members, from investors. The presentation that would determine Meridian's future was waiting. We'll figure it out, Margaret said. After school, weekends, whatever works. Sophia, what you did in that elevator wasn't just impressive, it was revelatory. I built this company by recognizing talent and opportunity. Right now you represent both. Sophia smiled, but her expression remained thoughtful. Mrs. Chun, can I ask you something? Of course. Why is this presentation so important to you? Margaret paused. It was an unexpectedly personal question from someone she had met less than an hour ago. But something about Sophia's direct gaze made evasion impossible. Because, Margaret said slowly, if I don't secure this funding, Meridian International will probably be acquired by a larger corporation within 6 months. Everything I've built will become a subsidiary of someone else's empire. And that would be bad because Margaret found herself considering a question she had never examined closely. Because I've spent 20 years proving that I could build something significant. If I lose the company now, it means I failed. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. Or it means you succeeded so well that what you built became valuable enough for someone else to want it. Margaret stared at her. In one sentence, this 12-year-old had reframed 20 years of Margaret's professional identity. I have to go, Margaret said softly. But Sophia, I want to continue this conversation. I want to learn what you can teach me. Sophia reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn notebook. She tore out a page and wrote something on it, then handed it to Margaret. Margaret looked at the paper. It contained a phone number and an address, but also something else, a short paragraph written in what appeared to be 5 different languages. What does this say? Margaret asked. Sophia smiled. It says, thank you for listening. Real communication requires courage. It's written in Korean, Mandarin, Spanish, Thai, and Tagalog, the same languages we used to solve the elevator problem. Margaret folded the paper carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Sophia Rodriguez, I think you just changed my life. Mrs. Chun, Sophia called as Margaret turned to go. Margaret looked back. Your presentation is going to go well, Sophia said confidently. Because now you understand something you didn't understand an hour ago. What's that? Sophia's eyes sparkled with wisdom that seemed far beyond her 12 years. The most important problems can't be solved from the top down. They can only be solved by bringing different perspectives together and letting them communicate. Honestly, Margaret felt a smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile she had worn in weeks. Sophia Rodriguez, she said, you may be the smartest person I've ever met. As Margaret hurried toward the boardroom that would determine her company's future, she carried with her not just the relief of having made it to her presentation on time, but something far more valuable, a completely new understanding of what leadership actually meant. And in her pocket, a piece of paper written in 5 languages served as a reminder that the most important lessons often came from the most unexpected teachers. 6 months later, Margaret Chun stood in the newly renovated 25th floor of the Meridian building, watching Sophia Rodriguez conduct what had become known throughout the company as a communication bridge session. The space bore no resemblance to a traditional corporate conference room. Instead of a long table with chairs arranged hierarchically, the room featured comfortable seating areas arranged in a circle, with translation equipment and multiple screens displaying real-time transcriptions in 6 languages. Around the circle sat 12 people: Korean IT specialists, Chinese software developers, Filipino engineers, Thai facilities coordinators, Vietnamese safety supervisors, Spanish-speaking maintenance workers, and English-speaking executives. For the first time in Meridian's history, every level of the organization was represented in a single decision-making session. Sophia, now 13 and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone whose insights had transformed an entire corporation, was facilitating a discussion about the company's expansion into Southeast Asian markets. But this wasn't the expansion Margaret had originally pitched to investors. This was something far more ambitious and far more sustainable. Mr. Park, Sophia said, addressing the senior IT specialist in Korean before switching seamlessly to English. For the benefit of the full group, you mentioned concerns about network infrastructure in the Manila offices. Can you explain the specific technical challenges? Mr. Park responded in Korean, his explanation detailed and passionate. Sophia listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, then turned to the group. Mr. Park says that the standard network architecture we use in North American offices won't work in Manila because of different power grid specifications and internet infrastructure limitations. He's identified 3 specific technical modifications that would be necessary, but he's concerned that the Home Office won't approve the additional costs. Margaret watched as Robert Harrison, her CFO, leaned forward with interest rather than the immediate cost-cutting instincts he would have shown 6 months ago. What kind of additional costs are we talking about? Robert asked. Sophia translated the question into Korean. Mr. Park's response was immediate and specific. Sophia then turned to Maria Santos, one of the Filipino engineers. Maria, Mr. Park's concerns align with the infrastructure challenges you identified during your site visit last month. Can you share your perspective? Maria responded in Spanish, her explanation animated and detailed. Sophia nodded, asked 2 follow-up questions in Spanish, then addressed the full group. Maria agrees with Mr. Park's technical assessment, but she's identified a potential solution. There's a local Filipino technology company that specializes in hybrid infrastructure systems designed specifically for the Manila market. Their equipment costs 30% more initially, but it would reduce our ongoing maintenance costs by 60% and improve system reliability significantly. Margaret felt the familiar thrill of watching a complex problem transform into an elegant solution. But what amazed her wasn't just the practical resolution, it was the process itself. 6 months ago, Mr. Park's concerns would have been filtered through multiple layers of management, translated poorly if at all, and probably dismissed as resistance to change. Maria's insights would never have reached the decision-makers at all. Now not only were both perspectives being heard clearly, but they were building on each other to create solutions that none of the participants could have developed individually. Dr. Patel, the executive vice president who had initially been skeptical of Sophia's consulting role, raised his hand. Sophia, I have to admit, when Margaret first proposed this new communication structure, I thought it would slow down our decision-making process. But we're solving problems in one session that used to take weeks of back-and-forth meetings. Sophia smiled. Dr. Patel, that's because you're no longer playing telephone with critical information. When people can communicate directly, in their most precise language, and have that communication immediately accessible to everyone who needs it, problems get solved faster, not slower. The session continued for another hour, with Sophia orchestrating discussions that moved fluidly between languages and perspectives. Margaret watched her facilitate technical debates, cultural considerations, financial analyses, and strategic planning with the skill of someone 3 times her age. But Sophia's transformation of Meridian went far beyond these formal sessions. Over the past 6 months, she had quietly revolutionized how the company operated at every level. The overnight maintenance crew now had direct communication channels to engineering and executive teams, allowing them to report problems and suggest solutions in real time. Equipment failures that used to escalate into costly emergency repairs were now prevented through proactive maintenance based on insights from workers who actually touched the systems daily. The cleaning staff had been reclassified as environmental systems specialists and given formal input into space utilization and efficiency improvements. Their observations about traffic patterns, equipment usage, and environmental conditions had led to office redesigns that improved both productivity and employee satisfaction. Most remarkably, Sophia had identified and recruited a network of multilingual employees who had been invisible to management but were natural connectors within their communities. These employees now served as official cultural communication liaisons, helping to bridge not just language gaps but cultural differences that affected everything from scheduling to conflict resolution. The results spoke for themselves. Employee satisfaction scores had increased by 40%. Equipment downtime had decreased by 60%. The company had successfully opened 3 new Southeast Asian offices, using locally adapted approaches that were both more effective and less expensive than their traditional expansion model. And the investors who had once waited impatiently in a boardroom while Margaret was trapped in an elevator had not only approved the original funding request, but had committed to a second round of investment based on Meridian's innovative approach to international expansion. After the communication bridge session ended, Margaret found herself alone with Sophia in the now empty room. "How do you feel about all this?" Margaret asked, gesturing toward the space that had become the symbolic heart of Meridian's transformation. Sophia was packing her notebooks, the same worn school supplies she had carried 6 months ago, though now she also had a tablet and a sophisticated translation headset provided by the company. "It feels like a beginning," Sophia said thoughtfully. "But not an ending. What do you mean?" Sophia looked out the window toward the city skyline, where dozens of other corporate towers reflected the afternoon sun. "Mrs. Chun, what we've done here at Meridian is important, but it's not unique. Every organization has people like my father, like Mr. Park, like Maria, people who understand how things really work but don't get hurt because they speak the wrong language or work at the wrong level or have the wrong kind of education." Margaret nodded slowly. "You're thinking bigger than one company. I'm thinking about what happens when people realize that the solutions to their biggest problems are probably sitting right in front of them, just speaking languages they haven't learned to hear yet." Sophia picked up her backpack, the same faded denim one she had carried into the elevator 6 months ago. But everything else about her had changed. She moved with the confidence of someone whose ideas had been tested and proven. She spoke with the authority of someone whose insights had transformed lives. "Sophia," Margaret said, "I have something to tell you." Sophia turned, her expression curious. "Next month, I'm speaking at the International Conference on Organizational Leadership. It's the biggest gathering of CEOs and business leaders in the world. I want you to speak with me." Sophia's eyes widened slightly. "About what?" "About everything we've learned together. About communication across differences. About finding expertise in unexpected places. About what leadership actually means when you stop assuming you already know everything." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Mrs. Chun, if I speak at that conference, I want to say something that might be uncomfortable for a lot of the people in the audience." "What's that?" Sophia met her eyes directly. "I want to tell them that most organizational problems aren't actually complicated. They're just invisible to the people who have the power to solve them. And that the fastest way to become a better leader is to admit how much you don't know about your own organization." Margaret felt the same thrill she had experienced in the elevator, the recognition of profound truth delivered with startling clarity. "Sophia Rodriguez," she said, "I think you're going to change a lot more than one company." That evening, Margaret sat in her office reviewing the quarterly reports that showed Meridian's remarkable transformation. But her attention kept drifting to the window, where she could see the lights of apartments and businesses throughout the city, each one representing communities of people working together, communicating across differences, solving problems that seemed impossible until someone bothered to really listen. Her phone rang. It was David, her assistant, with a message that would have stressed her enormously 6 months ago. "Margaret, I just got a call from Yamamoto Industries. They want to discuss a potential acquisition of Meridian Southeast Asian operations." 6 months ago, Margaret would have seen this as a threat, a sign of failure, proof that she couldn't protect what she had built. Now she found herself smiling. "David, set up a meeting. But not in our boardroom. Let's use the communication bridge room. And make sure Sophia is available to facilitate. Are you sure? This is a pretty high-stakes negotiation." Margaret looked at the piece of paper she still kept in her desk drawer, covered with writing. In 5 languages that said, "Thank you for listening." Real communication requires courage. "David," she said, "the highest stakes conversations are exactly the ones where you need people who really know how to listen." After ending the call, Margaret realized that Sophia had been right about success and failure. Meridian International was being pursued for acquisition, not because Margaret had failed, but because she had succeeded so completely at creating something valuable that others wanted to learn from it. But more importantly, Margaret had learned that the most significant transformations happened not when you protected what you had built, but when you opened it up to perspectives you had never considered. The 12-year-old girl who had spoken 5 languages in a broken elevator had taught a successful CEO the most important lesson of her career, that real leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about creating spaces where the right questions could finally be heard. And in conference rooms and boardrooms around the world, other leaders were about to discover what Margaret Chun had learned in the most unexpected classroom of her life. The future belonged to those brave enough to listen to voices they had never heard before, speaking truths in languages they were finally ready to learn. The International Conference on Organizational Leadership was held in Geneva, Switzerland. In a gleaming convention center that overlooked Lake Geneva, 1,500 of the world's most influential business leaders had gathered for 3 days of presentations, workshops, and networking sessions that would shape corporate strategies for years to come. Sofia Rodriguez stood backstage wearing a simple navy blue dress that her father had insisted on buying for the occasion, despite her protests that her usual clothes were perfectly fine. She held her worn notebook in one hand and a small device that looked like a hearing aid in the other. The device was her latest invention, developed with help from Meridian's technology team, a real-time translation tool that could process multiple languages simultaneously and transmit the results directly to wireless earpieces worn by audience members. "You ready for this, Mia?" Miguel Rodriguez asked, straightening his own tie awkwardly. He looked uncomfortable in the formal suit that Margaret had arranged for him, but his pride in his daughter was unmistakable. Sophia smiled at her father. Over the past year, Miguel's life had changed almost as dramatically as Sophia's. He was no longer working night maintenance shifts. Instead, he had been promoted to Director of Integrated Systems Communication at Meridian, a position that Margaret had created specifically for him after realizing that his understanding of building systems was matched only by his insight into how people actually work together. "Papa, I'm not nervous about speaking," Sophia said. "I'm nervous about what happens after," Miguel understood. The presentation they were about to give wouldn't just share Meridian's success story. It would challenge fundamental assumptions about hierarchy, expertise, and communication that formed the foundation of most major corporations. Some leaders in the audience would be inspired. Others would be threatened. Margaret appeared from the wings, looking elegant in a charcoal gray suit, but carrying herself with a relaxed confidence that would have been impossible 2 years ago. Her transformation had been as remarkable as her company's. The woman who had once ruled through careful control and strategic distance now led through genuine curiosity and collaborative exploration. "The audio team says we're ready," Margaret said. "Sophia, are you sure you want to do the simultaneous translation yourself? We could have professional interpreters handle it." Sophia shook her head. "This isn't just about translating words, Mrs. Chun. It's about translating ideas that don't exist in traditional business language. I need to do it myself." Dr. Patricia Williams, the conference organizer, appeared with a clipboard and a look of barely contained anxiety. Dr. Williams had been skeptical about including Sophia in the program. A 14-year-old speaker at the world's premier business leadership conference was unprecedented, potentially risky, and definitely unconventional. "Ms. Rodriguez, Mrs. Chun, you're on in 5 minutes," Dr. Williams said. I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about this presentation format? The board is already concerned about the age factor. And now you're telling me you're going to challenge some of our most distinguished attendees directly? Margaret placed a gentle hand on Dr. Williams' shoulder. Patricia, 2 years ago, I would have shared your concerns. But I've learned that the most important conversations happen when we stop protecting people from ideas that might make them uncomfortable. Sophia looked through the gap in the curtains at the massive auditorium filled with CEOs, presidents, and directors from companies that employed millions of people worldwide. She recognized some faces from business magazines and news programs. These were people accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, the final decision makers, the ones with the answers. You know what's interesting about that audience? Sophia said quietly to Margaret and her father. What? Margaret asked. Half of them are probably dealing with communication problems in their organizations right now. Equipment failures that could have been prevented, employee conflicts that stem from misunderstandings, international expansions that are struggling because of cultural barriers. But they think those are operational issues, not leadership issues. Miguel nodded. They don't see the connection between how people talk to each other and how well the business runs. Exactly, Sophia said. They're about to learn that every problem they think requires more money, more technology, or more expertise actually requires better listening. Dr. Williams introduced them with a brief description of Meridian's transformation, though Sophia could tell from her tone that Dr. Williams still wasn't entirely sure what she was introducing. The audience applause was polite but reserved. Sophia could sense the skepticism radiating from the auditorium as she walked onto the stage with Margaret. The stage setup was unconventional. Instead of a traditional podium, there were 3 comfortable chairs arranged in a triangle. Sophia had insisted on this configuration because she wanted the presentation to feel like a conversation rather than a lecture. Margaret began by sharing the story of the elevator incident, but she told it differently than Sophia had expected. Instead of focusing on the technical problem, or even Sophia's impressive coordination skills, Margaret emphasized her own ignorance. I had been running Meridian International for 20 years, Margaret said to the audience, and I realized that I knew almost nothing about how my company actually functioned. I knew the organizational chart, the financial reports, the strategic objectives, but I had no idea how decisions were really made, how problems were really solved, or how people really communicated with each other. A murmur ran through the audience. TEOs didn't usually begin presentations by admitting ignorance. Sophia stood and walked to the center of the stage. How many people in this audience speak more than one language? She asked. About half the hands in the auditorium went up. How many of you have employees who speak languages you don't speak? Nearly every hand rose. How many of you have ever sat in on a conversation between your employees when they didn't know you were listening and heard them discussing problems or solutions that had never been reported to management? The hands went down. Only a few dozen remained raised. Sophia nodded. That's the gap I want to talk about today. Not the language gap, but the listening gap. The space between what your organizations know and what you think they know. She activated her translation device and began speaking in Korean. Simultaneously, her English translation played through the auditorium speakers, while Korean appeared on screens around the room. I'm telling you in Korean that there's probably someone in your maintenance department who has identified a way to reduce your energy costs by 20%, but who has never been asked for input on operational efficiency. She switched to Mandarin, continuing the simultaneous translation. I'm telling you in Mandarin that there's probably someone in your IT department who knows exactly why your system integration projects keep failing, but who has never been included in strategic planning meetings. Spanish next. I'm telling you in Spanish that there's probably someone in your facilities management team who understands your space utilization better than the consultants you hired to optimize it, but who has never been consulted about office design. Sophia returned to English. I just told you the same thing in 3 different languages, but you probably learned something different from each version. Not because the translation was different, but because different languages carry different cultural assumptions about hierarchy, expertise, and who gets to speak about what. The audience was completely silent now, their attention focused with an intensity that Sophia could feel. When Mrs. Chun got trapped in that elevator, Sophia continued, she discovered that her building was full of people who had solutions to problems she didn't even know existed. But more importantly, she discovered that the reason she didn't know about these problems wasn't because the information didn't exist. It was because she had never created systems for hearing information that came from unexpected sources. Margaret stood and joined Sophia in the center of the stage. Sophia is being modest about her role in Meridian's transformation. She didn't just solve a communication problem. She redesigned our entire approach to organizational intelligence. Sophia shook her head. Mrs. Chun, I didn't redesign anything. I just pointed out that the intelligence was already there. We just had to stop filtering it through systems that only recognize certain kinds of expertise. She turned back to the audience. How many of you have organizational charts that show clear lines of communication from top to bottom? Most hands went up. How many of you have systems for gathering information that flows from bottom to top? Far fewer hands remained raised. How many of you have systems for gathering information that flows horizontally between departments, between cultural groups, between different types of workers? Almost no hands remained up. Sophia walked closer to the audience, abandoning the stage entirely and moving into the first row of seats. The reason Mrs. Chun didn't know about the elevator's communication problems wasn't because her maintenance staff was incompetent. It was because she had never asked her maintenance staff to explain how the building actually worked. She assumed that if there were serious problems, someone would report them through official channels. She turned to face a distinguished man in the front row who Sophia recognized as the CEO of a major technology company. Sir, when was the last time you had a conversation with someone in your organization who doesn't report to you and asked them not what they think you want to hear, but what they think you need to know? The man looked uncomfortable. We have regular employee surveys and feedback mechanisms. Sophia nodded politely. Surveys are useful, but they're not conversations. Surveys ask people to respond to questions you've already decided are important. Conversations let people tell you about problems you didn't know existed. She moved deeper into the audience, her confidence growing as she saw engagement replacing skepticism on faces throughout the auditorium. I want to try an experiment, Sophia announced. Everyone in this auditorium leads organizations with hundreds or thousands of employees. I'm going to ask you to think about a specific problem your organization is currently facing. Something that has been difficult to solve, that has persisted despite your best efforts. Sophia paused, letting the audience mentally identify their challenges. Now I want you to consider this possibility. Somewhere in your organization, there's probably someone who knows exactly how to solve that problem. But that person has never been asked because they work in the wrong department, or have the wrong job title, or speak the wrong language, or have the wrong kind of educational background. The silence in the auditorium was profound. The question isn't whether this person exists, Sophia continued. The question is whether you have systems for finding them and hearing what they have to say. Miguel stood from his seat in the front row and joined Sophia and Margaret on the stage. Sophia had planned this moment carefully. She wanted the audience to see that transformation happened not just through individual insights, but through changes in relationships and structures. My father is here today, Sophia said, not because he's my father, but because he represents something that most organizations overlook. He understands systems integration at a level that goes far beyond technical specifications. He understands how human systems and mechanical systems interact, how cultural differences affect operational efficiency, how informal communication networks can prevent or cause systemic failures. Miguel stepped forward, and Sophia could see him overcome his natural reluctance to speak to such a high-powered audience. 2 years ago, Miguel said, his English careful but clear, I would come to work, fix problems, and go home. If I saw bigger problems that would require changes in procedures or policies, I didn't report them because I knew that suggestions from maintenance workers don't usually reach decision makers. He paused, gathering confidence. Now, I work directly with engineers, with executives, with people from different departments, because Sophia and Mrs. Chun created systems for conversations that didn't exist before. Not formal meetings, not reports, but real conversations where people can explain what they see and what they know. Sophia noticed movement in the audience as people leaned forward, genuinely engaged now. The result, Miguel continued, is that problems get solved before they become expensive. Equipment lasts longer because we understand how it's actually being used, not just how it's supposed to be used. Employee satisfaction is higher because people feel heard. And the company saves money because we're preventing problems instead of just reacting to them. Margaret retook the stage. I want to share some specific numbers with you, because I know this audience appreciates concrete results. She clicked a remote, and a series of slides appeared on the screens around the auditorium. Since implementing Sophia's communication integration systems, Meridian has seen a 47% reduction in equipment downtime, a 62% decrease in project delays, and a 38% improvement in employee retention. Our international expansion projects are completing an average of 3 months, ahead of schedule and 15% under budget. The audience was paying close attention now. These were results that spoke directly to their primary concerns. But the most significant change, Margaret continued, isn't measurable in traditional metrics. It's that I now understand my own organization in ways that have fundamentally changed how I make decisions. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a complex diagram of communication flows within Meridian. This diagram shows how information actually moves through our company now. It looks nothing like our organizational chart. Information flows in multiple directions, through informal networks, across cultural and linguistic boundaries, between departments that used to operate in isolation. Sophia stepped forward again. Mrs. Chun, can you show them the comparison? Slide? Margaret clicked to a slide that showed Meridian's communication patterns from 2 years earlier. The contrast was striking. The old pattern looked like a traditional hierarchy, with information flowing up and down through rigid channels. The new pattern looked like a neural network, with connections forming organically wherever they were needed. The old system, Sophia said, was designed for control and clarity. The new system is designed for intelligence and adaptation. The old system told people what to communicate and how to communicate it. The new system asks people what they need to communicate and creates channels for them to do it effectively. She turned to address the audience directly. How many of you have dealt with international expansion challenges? Most hands went up. How many of you have had projects fail because of communication problems between your home office and international teams? About half the hands remained raised. How many of you solved those problems by hiring more translators or creating more detailed procedures? Most of the raised hands stayed up. Sophia nodded. That's exactly what Mrs. Chun tried first. More translators, more procedures, more oversight. But those solutions treat communication problems as technical problems. They assume that if you can just transfer information more efficiently, you'll get better results. She paused, letting this sink in. But most international business failures aren't caused by information transfer problems. They're caused by cultural understanding problems. And you can't solve cultural understanding problems with technical solutions. A woman in the third row raised her hand. Sophia nodded to her. Ms. Rodriguez, what you're describing sounds very idealistic, but how do you scale it? How do you implement these kinds of communication systems in organizations with tens of thousands of employees? Sophia smiled. This was exactly the question she had been hoping for. That's the beautiful thing about real communication systems, she said. They scale naturally because they're based on human relationships, not technical infrastructure. When you create space for authentic conversation, people automatically start creating networks with other people who can help them solve problems. She walked back toward the woman who had asked the question. At Meridian, we didn't implement a system and then train people to use it. We identified people who were already communicating effectively across differences, and we amplified what they were doing. We gave them resources, recognition, and authority to expand their networks. Margaret added, Sophia is right about the scaling question. We now have what we call communication bridge networks in all our offices worldwide. These aren't formal reporting structures. They're organic networks of employees who have demonstrated ability to translate not just languages, but cultural perspectives, technical concepts, and operational realities. A man near the back of the auditorium called out, This all sounds very nice, but what about accountability? How do you maintain quality control when you're relying on informal networks? Sophia could hear the skepticism in his voice, but also genuine curiosity. Sir, accountability improves when communication improves, she replied. When people understand what's expected of them, when they have clear channels for asking questions and reporting problems, when they feel like their input is valued, they take more ownership of outcomes. She gestured to her father. Papa, can you give an example of how accountability changed in your department? Miguel nodded. Before, when equipment failed, we would fix it and file a report. The report would go to supervisors, then to managers, then maybe to executives if the problem was expensive enough. By the time decision makers heard about it, the information was filtered and summarized, and sometimes wrong. He gained confidence as he spoke. Now, when equipment shows signs of potential failure, I can communicate directly with engineers, with procurement, with scheduling, with anyone who needs to know. We can prevent failures instead of just responding to them. But more important, everyone involved understands their role in prevention, not just repair. Sophia added, the accountability question assumes that informal networks are less reliable than formal hierarchies. But our experience suggests the opposite. When people have direct relationships with the people affected by their work, they're more accountable, not less. The questions continued for another 30 minutes with Sophia, Margaret, and Miguel, working together to address concerns about implementation, measurement, cultural resistance, and practical logistics. Sophia noticed that the tone of the questions had shifted from skepticism to genuine problem-solving curiosity. Finally, Dr. Williams stepped onto the stage to signal that the session was ending. Before we close, Sophia said, I want to leave you with a challenge. The auditorium fell silent. When you return to your organizations, I want you to find one person who knows something important that you don't know. Not someone who reports to you, not someone whose job description includes advising executives, but someone who understands some aspect of your business that you've never thought to ask about. She paused, looking around the room. Have a conversation with that person. Not a meeting, not an interview, but a conversation. Ask them what they see that you might be missing. Ask them what problems they've observed that don't get reported through official channels. Ask them what solutions they've imagined, but never had a chance to propose. Sophia walked back to the center of the stage where Margaret and Miguel were waiting. Most importantly, listen to their answers without immediately thinking about whether their observations fit your existing frameworks or assumptions. Just listen and learn. She picked up her worn notebook from the chair where she had left it. You might discover, like Mrs. Chun did, that your organization is full of intelligence and insight and solutions that have been invisible to you not because they don't exist, but because you haven't created space for them to be seen. The applause began slowly, then built to a sustained ovation, but Sophia barely heard it. She was watching faces in the audience, looking for signs that the ideas had truly landed, that people were processing them seriously rather than just responding politely to an unusual presentation. What she saw gave her hope. Scattered throughout the auditorium, she could see executives leaning toward each other, having quiet, intense conversations. She could see people taking notes, making phone calls, sending messages. The ideas weren't just being politely received. They were being actively considered. After the formal session ended, dozens of audience members approached the stage with questions, business cards, and requests for follow-up consultations. Sophia found herself surrounded by CEOs and directors who wanted to understand how to implement communication bridge systems in their own organizations. But the conversation that mattered most to Sophia happened later that evening, in the hotel lobby, with a quiet woman who had sat in the back row during the presentation. Ms. Rodriguez, the woman said, approaching Sophia while she sat with her. Father and Margaret, my name is Dr. Sarah Kim. I'm the head of organizational development for the United Nations. Sophia looked up with interest. The UN represented the ultimate test case for cross-cultural communication and organizational effectiveness. I've been working on communication problems in international organizations for 15 years, Dr. Kim continued. What you described today addresses challenges that we've struggled with at the highest levels of international cooperation. She sat down across from Sophia. I'd like to invite you to Geneva to work with our organizational development team. Not as a consultant, but as a partner. We have problems that require exactly the kind of thinking you've demonstrated. Sophia glanced at her father, then at Margaret. This was the opportunity she had imagined but never dared to expect. A chance to apply communication bridge concepts at a global scale, with stakes that went far beyond corporate profits. Dr. Kim, Sophia said carefully, I'm still in high school. Dr. Kim smiled. Ms. Rodriguez, after watching you facilitate that presentation today, I'm not concerned about your educational credentials. I'm interested in your ability to help solve problems that traditional expertise has been unable to address. Sophia looked at her father again. Miguel's expression showed pride, excitement, and just a trace of concern about his teenage daughter being recruited by international organizations. What kind of problems? Sophia asked. Communication failures between peacekeeping forces and local populations. Cultural misunderstandings that undermine humanitarian aid programs. Language barriers that prevent effective coordination during crisis response. Resource allocation conflicts that stem from different cultural approaches to decision-making. Dr. Kim leaned forward. These aren't academic problems, Sophia. They're life and death challenges that affect millions of people. And they're exactly the kind of challenges that your approach to communication integration could help solve. Sophia felt the familiar thrill of recognizing a complex problem that could be approached through better listening and cross-cultural understanding. But she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with such opportunities. I'll need to finish high school, she said. And I'll need to make sure my father's position at Meridian is secure. Margaret immediately spoke up. Miguel's position is permanent, Sophia, and we can arrange for you to complete your education while working on international projects. Distance learning, tutoring, whatever you need. Sophia smiled at Margaret's immediate support, but she had already made her decision. Dr. Kim, I accept your invitation, but I have one condition. What's that? Sophia gestured toward her father and Margaret. I don't work alone. Communication bridge building requires teams of people who understand different aspects of the challenge. I'll need collaborators who understand local contexts, technical systems, cultural dynamics, and organizational structures. Dr. Kim nodded immediately. Of course, we're not looking for individual expertise, Sophia. We're looking for new approaches to collaborative problem solving. As Sophia shook hands with Dr. Kim, committing to her next challenge, she realized that the elevator incident 2 years ago had been more than a crisis that revealed hidden capabilities. It had been the beginning of a completely different understanding of how human organizations could function. The scared 12-year-old who had once sat in a broken elevator, speaking 5 languages to coordinate a complex technical operation, had become a 14-year-old who was being recruited to help solve some of the world's most intractable communication challenges. But what Sophia found most satisfying wasn't her own transformation. It was watching Margaret and her father discover capabilities they had never known they possessed, and seeing organizations learn to recognize intelligence and insight that had always been present but never acknowledged. That night, as Sophia lay in her hotel bed looking out at the lights of Geneva, she thought about the conversation she had promised to have with international leaders, about the problems she had committed to help solve, and about the communication bridges she would help build between cultures and languages and perspectives that had seemed impossibly different. She thought about her father, sleeping in the next room, who had gone from invisible maintenance worker to international organizational development consultant. She thought about Margaret, who had transformed from isolated executive to collaborative leader. And she thought about the hundreds of business leaders who had left the conference that day with new questions about their own organizations. Sophia pulled out her notebook and wrote a single sentence in 5 languages, the way she had 2 years ago when she had first met Margaret Chun. Every voice carries wisdom that someone needs to hear. Tomorrow she would begin the work of proving that this simple truth could change not just companies, but the world. 5 years after the Geneva conference, Sophia Rodriguez stood in the Emergency Operations Center of the United Nations Humanitarian Coordination Office in New York, surrounded by screens displaying crisis situations from around the globe. At 19, she had become the youngest senior advisor in UN history, but more importantly, she had helped develop communication protocols that were saving lives in disaster zones across 6 continents. The current crisis was unfolding in the Philippines, where a Category 5 typhoon had devastated coastal communities and left rescue teams struggling to coordinate relief efforts. Traditional command structures had broken down, leaving international aid workers, local emergency responders, and displaced civilians unable to communicate effectively across language and cultural barriers. Sophia wore a headset connected to her latest innovation, a real-time cultural translation system that didn't just convert words between languages, but helped bridge the conceptual gaps that often caused more problems than linguistic differences. On the main screen, she could see live feeds from rescue helicopters, emergency shelters, and coordination centers, where her communication bridge protocols were being tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Sophia, we're getting reports of confusion at the Manila Coordination Center, called out Dr. Aleta Vasquez, the Crisis Response Director. The Australian search and rescue team can't coordinate with the local boat operators. They're speaking English, but they're not understanding each other. Sophia pulled up the audio feed from Manila and listened to the conversation. The Australian team leader was giving precise coordinates and technical instructions in clear English. The Filipino boat operators were responding in equally clear English. But Sophia could immediately hear the problem that neither side recognized. They're using different frameworks for describing water conditions and navigation hazards, Sophia said into her microphone, addressing both teams simultaneously. Captain Morrison, when you say moderate seas, you're referring to the Beaufort scale measurement. Captain Santos, when you hear moderate seas, you're thinking about local tidal conditions that are completely different from open ocean measurements. She switched to Tagalog to speak directly with the Filipino team, then back to English for the Australians. Captain Morrison, the local waters have submerged debris and changed depth conditions that aren't reflected in your charts. Captain Santos is trying to warn you about hazards that don't exist in standard maritime terminology. Within minutes, the two teams were sharing information effectively, with Sophia facilitating a technical conversation that addressed both international safety protocols and local environmental knowledge. The rescue operation resumed with dramatically improved coordination. Dr. Vasquez shook her head in amazement. 5 years ago, that kind of communication breakdown would have cost us hours and potentially lives. Now you resolve it in minutes. Sophia was already moving to the next crisis point on her screen. Dr. Vasquez, the real breakthrough isn't the technology. It's that we've trained people to recognize when they're having translation problems versus understanding problems. Captain Morrison knew something was wrong because Captain Santos kept repeating the same warnings. Captain Santos knew something was wrong because Captain Morrison wasn't acknowledging the local hazards. She pulled up another feed, this one from a refugee camp in Jordan, where aid distribution had stalled due to what appeared to be logistical problems. "Look at this situation," Sophia said, pointing to the screen. "The relief coordinator is reporting that families aren't following the food distribution schedule. She's assuming it's a compliance issue or a communication problem about timing." Sophia activated the audio feed and listened to conversations in Arabic between families waiting in line. After a few minutes, she activated her translation system and called the relief coordinator. "Sarah, the families understand the schedule perfectly. The problem is that the distribution timing conflicts with prayer schedules and cultural practices around family meals. The families are trying to balance religious obligations with food security needs." The relief coordinator's voice came through clearly. "Sophia, how do we solve that? We can't change the entire distribution system for cultural preferences." "You don't need to change the entire system," Sophia replied. "You need to adjust the timing by 30 minutes and create a secondary distribution point for families who can't access the main schedule. The local imam has already identified volunteer coordinators who can manage the alternative distribution." Sophia switched to Arabic to coordinate directly with the volunteer coordinators, then back to English to update the relief coordinator. Within an hour, food distribution had resumed with full community participation. These kinds of interventions had become routine for Sophia, but she never forgot that each successful communication bridge represented families who would eat, children who would receive medical care, or communities that would be evacuated safely from danger zones. Her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Chen, who was now serving as an unofficial advisor to Sophia's UN work while continuing to run Meridian International. The message was brief: "Turn on CNN, important development." Sophia pulled up the news feed on one of her auxiliary screens and saw a familiar face: Dr. Patricia Williams, the former conference organizer who had been skeptical about Sophia's presentation in Geneva. 5 years earlier, Dr. Williams was now being interviewed about her new book, The Listening Revolution: How a Teenager Changed Corporate America. Dr. Williams, the CNN interviewer, was saying, "Your book argues that Sofia Rodriguez's communication theories have fundamentally altered how major corporations operate internationally. Can you give us specific examples?" Dr. Williams, who had become one of Sophia's most vocal advocates after implementing communication bridge systems in dozens of major corporations, smiled at the camera. "In the 5 years since Sophia first presented her ideas in Geneva, we've documented over 300 major corporations that have adopted some version of her communication integration protocols. The results are remarkable. International project. Failure rates have dropped by an average of 40%. Employee satisfaction scores have increased by 30%. And companies are completing global expansions in half the time with significantly better local integration." Sophia watched with interest as Dr. Williams continued. But the most significant change isn't in the corporate metrics. It's in how leaders think about expertise and decision-making. We're seeing a fundamental shift from hierarchical information flow to network-based intelligence gathering. CEOs are learning to recognize that the solutions to their biggest challenges often exist within their organizations, just not in the places they've traditionally looked for answers. The interviewer leaned forward. "You've written that, Sophia. Rodriguez represents a new model of leadership. What do you mean by that?" "Traditional leadership models are based on the assumption that leaders need to have answers," Dr. Williams replied. "Sophia's approach is based on the assumption that leaders need to create conditions where the right answers can emerge from unexpected sources. It's a completely different paradigm." Sophia found herself both proud and slightly uncomfortable with the attention. The real satisfaction came not from recognition, but from watching the ideas spread and evolve in ways she never could have imagined. Her computer chimed with an incoming priority call. The screen showed the face of President Maria Elena Santos of the Philippines, calling from the Emergency Command Center in Manila. "Sophia," President Santos said without preamble, "I need your help with something that goes beyond disaster response." Sophia immediately gave the call her full attention. President Santos had become a strong supporter of communication bridge protocols after seeing their effectiveness during multiple natural disasters. "What can I do for you, Madam President?" "We're hosting the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit next month. 27 countries, 43 languages, and cultural differences that have prevented meaningful cooperation for decades. I want to try something unprecedented." Sophia felt the familiar excitement of recognizing a complex challenge that could benefit from communication integration approaches. "What are you thinking?" President Santos leaned forward, her expression intense. "I want to structure the entire summit around your communication bridge protocols. Instead of traditional diplomatic sessions where everyone speaks carefully prepared statements that avoid real issues, I want to create space for genuine problem-solving conversations." Sophia considered the implications. International diplomacy was built on formal protocols, careful language, and face-saving mechanisms that often prevented substantive progress on regional challenges. "Madam President, that would be a radical departure from standard diplomatic practice. Are the other leaders willing to participate in that kind of process?" 3 are enthusiastic, 7 are willing to try, and the rest will participate if they see it working, President Santos replied. "Sophia, we have regional challenges that require exactly the kind of cross-cultural collaboration that you've developed. Climate change adaptation, economic integration, migration management, resource sharing. These problems can't be solved through traditional diplomacy." Sophia felt the weight of the opportunity and the responsibility it represented. Success could demonstrate that communication bridge approaches could work at the highest levels of international relations. Failure could set back the credibility of collaborative problem-solving approaches for years. "I'll need a team," Sophia said. "Cultural liaisons, technical coordinators, people who understand both diplomatic protocol and collaborative facilitation." "Whatever you need," President Santos replied immediately. "Sophia, if we can make this work, it could change how international cooperation functions globally." After ending the call, Sophia sat quietly for a moment, processing the magnitude of what she had just committed to facilitate. Dr. Vasquez approached her workstation. "Big opportunity?" Dr. Vasquez asked. "Potentially transformative," Sophia replied, "or potentially disastrous." She picked up her phone and called Margaret Chun. When Margaret answered, Sophia could hear the familiar sounds of Meridian's Communication Bridge Center in the background. "Margaret, I need advice about scaling up." "How far up?" Margaret asked. "International diplomacy. 27 countries. Issues that could affect millions of people." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Sophia, That's exactly the kind of challenge that communication bridge approaches were designed for. But you're going to need infrastructure and support systems that don't exist yet. What do you mean? You've been working with crisis response teams and corporate organizations where people are motivated to solve immediate problems. Margaret explained. Diplomatic settings involve people who are motivated to avoid appearing weak or uninformed. The psychological dynamics are completely different. Sophia nodded, recognizing the validity of Margaret's concern. So how do we create conditions where diplomats feel safe being genuinely collaborative? The same way we did at Meridian, Margaret replied. We start by demonstrating that collaboration produces better results than competition. But in diplomatic settings, that means you need to structure the process so that everyone can claim success. Sophia found herself smiling. You're saying we need to engineer diplomatic face-saving into the communication bridge protocols. Exactly. And I know someone who could help you design that. Who? Your father. Miguel has been working with international teams at Meridian for 3 years now. He understands how to maintain respect for hierarchy while creating space for authentic problem solving. He's become an expert at what we call dignified collaboration. Sophia felt a surge of pride and affection for her father, who had continued to evolve and grow in ways that amazed her. Miguel had recently completed a master's degree in organizational systems, writing his thesis on cultural integration. In technical problem solving, his insights had become sought after by companies and organizations worldwide. Is he available for international consulting? Sophia asked. He's been hoping you'd ask, Margaret replied. Sophia, your father is proud of everything you've accomplished, but his greatest satisfaction comes from working with you on projects that matter. That evening, Sophia sat with Miguel in their apartment in Queens, the same small space where she had once helped him understand her school assignments and translate documents for neighbors. The walls now displayed photographs from conferences, humanitarian missions, and corporate transformations around the world. But the kitchen table where they sat was the same one where Sophia had first explained her ideas about communication bridges. Papa, are you ready for another adventure? Sophia asked. Miguel smiled. Mia, working with you has been the greatest adventure of my life. What are we solving this time? Sophia described the ASEAN Summit opportunity, the challenges of diplomatic protocol, and the potential for demonstrating collaborative problem-solving at an international scale. Miguel listened with the careful attention he brought to all complex problems. The key, Miguel said finally, will be helping each leader understand that collaborative success enhances their individual credibility rather than diminishing it. In corporate settings, people eventually realize that solving problems together makes everyone look better. In diplomatic settings, leaders often fear that cooperation will be seen as weakness. So how do we structure the process differently? Miguel leaned back, thinking. We need to create what I call visible individual contributions within collaborative success. Each leader needs to be able to point to specific insights or solutions that they contributed, while also being part of collective achievements that no one could have accomplished alone. Sophia felt the familiar excitement of watching a complex problem begin to resolve into manageable components. Papa, how do we design conversation structures that make individual expertise visible while building collaborative solutions? Miguel stood and walked to the small whiteboard that had become their planning space for challenging projects. We start by mapping the different types of expertise that each leader brings to regional challenges, he said, beginning to sketch. Economic development, environmental management, cultural preservation, technological innovation, governance systems. Each country has different strengths and different perspectives on these issues. He drew connecting lines between different types of expertise. Then we design conversation sequences that allow each leader to demonstrate their unique knowledge while learning from others' expertise. Instead of competitive presentations, we create collaborative exploration sessions. Sophia watched her father develop a framework that balanced diplomatic dignity with authentic problem-solving, and she realized that their partnership had evolved far beyond a daughter learning from her father's wisdom. They had become genuine collaborators, each bringing different insights to challenges that neither could solve alone. "Miguel, you've just designed a diplomatic innovation that could change international cooperation," Sophia said. Miguel smiled. "Mia, I learned from watching you that the best solutions come from combining different perspectives. I just applied that lesson to diplomatic psychology." As they continued planning late into the night, Sophia reflected on how far they had all traveled from that morning in a broken elevator, when a 12-year-old girl had demonstrated that complex problems could be solved through patient listening and multilingual coordination. Now she was preparing to facilitate conversations between world leaders about challenges that affected entire regions, using principles that had emerged from her father's practical wisdom about how people really communicated across differences. The scared child who had once translated emergency instructions between 5 languages had become a young woman who was about to test whether those same principles could help nations work together to solve problems that seemed impossibly complex. But as Sophia looked at her father, still sketching diplomatic frameworks on their small whiteboard in their modest Queen's apartment, she knew that the most important transformations weren't the grand international successes. They were the daily discoveries of what became possible when people learned to truly listen to each other across whatever differences seemed to separate them. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for the most challenging communication bridge she had ever attempted to build. Tonight, she was grateful to be planning it with the person who had first taught her that every voice carried wisdom that someone needed to hear. The ASEAN Summit in Manila became the most watched diplomatic event of the decade, not because of political drama or international tensions, but because 27 world leaders agreed to try something that had never been attempted in modern diplomacy: genuine collaborative problem-solving facilitated by a 20-year-old woman who had learned her skills in a broken elevator. Sophia stood in the central coordination room of the Manila International Conference Center, surrounded by screens displaying real-time translation feeds, cultural context analysis, and collaborative mapping tools that had been developed specifically for this unprecedented diplomatic experiment. World leaders sat not in the traditional formal assembly arrangement, but in small mixed groups designed to encourage authentic conversation across regional and cultural boundaries. President Santos had opened the summit with a simple statement that set the tone for everything that followed. "For the next 3 days, we are not here to represent our country's predetermined positions. We are here to understand regional challenges that affect all our people and to discover solutions that none of us could develop alone." The first test of Sophia's diplomatic communication protocols came during the session on climate adaptation, when the Prime Minister of Thailand and the President of Indonesia found themselves in what appeared to be a fundamental disagreement about carbon emission responsibilities. Traditional diplomatic process would have led to carefully worded statements that avoided direct confrontation while making no progress on substantive issues. Instead, Sophia facilitated a conversation that revealed the deeper structure underneath their apparent disagreement. "Prime Minister Thaksin," Sophia said, speaking in Thai before switching to English for the broader group, "when you talk about fair distribution of emission reduction responsibilities, you're referring to the principle that countries with higher historical emissions should bear greater costs for current solutions." She turned to President Widodo. "President Widodo, when you talk about realistic development priorities, you're referring to the principle that countries still building basic infrastructure shouldn't be constrained by environmental standards designed for post-industrial economies." Sophia paused, letting both leaders recognize that their positions had been accurately understood. Both principles are valid, but they address different timeframes and different types of responsibility. "Prime Minister, your framework focuses on historical justice and long-term sustainability. President Widodo, your framework focuses on current economic realities and development equity. She activated her collaborative mapping system, projecting a visual representation of the conversation onto screens around the room. What if we design climate adaptation strategies that honor both frameworks? Emission reduction responsibilities based on historical contribution, but implementation timelines and methods based on current development status and infrastructure capacity. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had occurred in previous diplomatic settings. Instead of defending predetermined positions, both leaders began exploring how their different perspectives could inform more effective and equitable regional climate policies. Miguel, who was serving as Sophia's senior collaboration coordinator, watched from the observation room as his daughter facilitated conversations between world leaders with the same patient attention to communication dynamics that she had once brought to helping neighbors understand medical bills. "She makes it look easy," said Dr. Kim from the UN, who had been observing the process with fascination. Miguel smiled. "It's not easy. It's just that Sophia learned early that most problems aren't actually complicated. They just require people to listen carefully enough to understand what's really being said underneath what appears to be said." By the second day of the summit, something remarkable had begun to happen. Leaders who had arrived with carefully prepared talking points were abandoning their scripts in favor of genuine exploration of regional challenges. The traditional diplomatic dynamic of competition for advantage had been replaced by collaborative investigation of shared problems. The breakthrough moment came during the session on economic integration, when Prime Minister Lee of Singapore made an observation that changed the entire trajectory of Southeast Asian cooperation. "I've been thinking about what President Santos said about representing our people rather than our positions," Prime Minister Lee said. "The economic challenges we're discussing, currency coordination, trade barriers, resource sharing, these aren't actually different problems for different countries. They're different symptoms of the same regional system dysfunction." Sophia leaned forward with interest. "Prime Minister Lee, can you elaborate on that system dysfunction? We've been trying to solve regional economic problems with national policies," Prime Minister Lee continued. "But regional problems require regional solutions. The question isn't how each country can maximize its individual economic advantage. The question is how we design regional economic systems that create shared prosperity." President Duterte of the Philippines nodded thoughtfully. "Prime Minister Lee is right. We've been competing with each other for foreign investment, for trade advantages, for resource access. But competition creates inefficiencies that hurt all of us." Sophia recognized the conversation dynamic that she had learned to identify years earlier, the moment when apparent conflicts revealed themselves to be different approaches to shared underlying concerns. "President Duterte, you're suggesting that regional economic cooperation isn't about sacrifice for the common good, but about recognition that regional prosperity creates better outcomes for individual countries than national competition." "Exactly," President Duterte replied. "Instead of 27 countries competing for limited global opportunities, we could be one integrated regional economy, creating expanded opportunities for everyone." The conversation that followed redefined the economic relationship between Southeast Asian nations. Instead of traditional trade negotiations focused on individual national advantage, the leaders began designing integrated regional economic systems based on shared prosperity principles. Margaret Chen, who had flown to Manila to observe the summit, found herself witnessing the application of communication bridge principles at a scale she had never imagined. The same approaches that had transformed Meridian International were now reshaping international relations between countries representing over 500 million people. "This is what you envisioned in that elevator 7 years ago, isn't it?" Margaret asked Sophia during a break between sessions. Sophia shook her head. I never envisioned anything this big. I just wanted to help people understand each other better. But I'm learning that when you create space for authentic communication, the solutions that emerge are often bigger than anyone imagined. Margaret looked out at the conference center, where world leaders were continuing their conversations in small groups, facilitated by the network of cultural communication specialists that Sophia had trained. Sophia, what you've accomplished here is going to change how international cooperation works globally. Other regions are already requesting similar facilitation for their diplomatic challenges. Sophia felt both pride and responsibility at the recognition of what had been achieved. But her attention was focused on the conversation she could see through the glass walls of the conference room, where the Prime Minister of Vietnam and the Sultan of Brunei were working together to design sustainable resource sharing agreements. That would have been impossible under traditional diplomatic frameworks. On the final day of the summit, the participating leaders did something unprecedented in modern diplomatic history. They issued a joint statement that acknowledged their collective responsibility for regional challenges and outlined collaborative solutions that none of them could have developed independently. But more significantly, they established the Southeast Asian Communication Bridge Institute, a permanent organization dedicated to facilitating cross-cultural collaboration on regional challenges. Sophia was asked to serve as the Institute's founding director, a position that would allow her to expand communication bridge approaches throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Standing at the podium to address the closing session of the summit, Sophia found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 7 years earlier, she had been a 12-year-old girl helping her father navigate the bureaucracy of building maintenance. Now she was being asked to help nations navigate the complexities of international cooperation. Honorable leaders, Sophia began, 3 days ago, we gathered as representatives of 27 different countries, with different languages, different cultures, different economic systems, and different political priorities. Today, we're concluding as partners in a regional community committed to shared prosperity and collaborative problem-solving. She paused, looking around the room at leaders who had discovered that their most intractable challenges became manageable when approached through authentic communication and genuine collaboration. The transformation we've experienced together demonstrates something important about human nature and organizational effectiveness. We don't need to eliminate our differences to work together successfully. We need to understand how our differences can inform better solutions to shared problems. Sophia gestured toward the screens around the room, which displayed the collaborative frameworks and communication protocols that had made the summit possible. The tools and processes we've used here aren't complicated. They're based on simple principles: listen carefully, translate accurately, build on each other's insights, and design solutions that honor everyone's legitimate concerns. She smiled, thinking about her father and Margaret, who were watching from the audience. But implementing these principles requires courage. The courage to admit what you don't know, to learn from unexpected sources, and to measure success by collective achievement rather than individual advantage. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, but Sophia barely heard it. She was thinking about the refugees who would receive better coordinated aid because of improved international cooperation, the environmental challenges that would be addressed through regional collaboration, the economic opportunities that would be created through integrated development strategies. After the formal closing ceremony, Sophia found herself in the hotel lobby with Miguel and Margaret, the three people whose partnership had made everything possible. "Mia," Miguel said, "when you were 12 years old and translating for Mrs. Chun in our apartment building, did you ever imagine you'd be facilitating conversations between world leaders?" Sophia laughed. "Papa, when I was 12 years old, I thought the biggest communication challenge in the world was helping Mr. Patel understand his insurance forms." Margaret shook her head in amazement. "Sophia, You've created a new model for international cooperation. The principles you've developed are being studied by diplomatic academies and international relations programs worldwide. But more importantly, Sophia replied, we've demonstrated that the same approaches that help individuals understand each other can help nations work together. The scale changes, but the fundamental principles remain the same. She pulled out her phone, which was displaying dozens of messages from organizations around the world requesting communication, bridge facilitation for their most challenging problems. Margaret, Miguel, are you ready for the next challenge? Miguel and Margaret exchanged glances, then smiled simultaneously. Always, they said in unison. 6 months later, Sophia stood in her new office at the Global Communication Bridge Institute in New York, looking out at the United Nations headquarters, where she had first learned to apply her communication principles to international humanitarian crises. The Institute had become a hub for collaborative problem-solving initiatives on every continent, addressing challenges that ranged from corporate organizational dysfunction to international diplomatic deadlocks. Her desk held invitations to facilitate communication bridge processes for the African Union, the European Parliament, the Organization of American States, and a consortium of Pacific Island nations facing climate change challenges. Each invitation represented an opportunity to demonstrate that authentic cross-cultural communication could transform seemingly impossible conflicts into manageable collaborative challenges. But the most meaningful item on her desk was a simple photograph: Miguel, Margaret, and Sophia standing together in front of the Meridian building, taken on the anniversary of the elevator incident that had started everything. All three were smiling, but their expressions showed the quiet satisfaction of people who had discovered that their most significant achievements came from helping others accomplish things they hadn't known were possible. Sophia picked up her phone and called her father, who was preparing to leave for Geneva to help the World Health Organization design communication bridge protocols for global health emergency response. "Papa," she said when he answered, "do you ever miss the simple days when our biggest challenge was fixing broken elevators?" Miguel laughed. "Mia, we're still fixing broken elevators. They're just bigger elevators now, with more people inside. Them, speaking more languages." Sophia smiled at the truth of that observation. "And we're still using the same approach. Listen carefully, translate accurately, and help everyone work together to solve the problem." "That's right," Miguel replied. "Some things don't change, no matter how big the stage gets." After ending the call, Sophia returned to reviewing proposals for the Institute's next major initiative, a global conference on collaborative leadership that would bring together business executives, government officials, nonprofit directors, and community organizers to explore how communication bridge principles could address the most pressing challenges of the 21st century. As she worked, Sophia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a scared 12-year-old in a broken elevator to an internationally recognized expert in cross-cultural communication and collaborative problem-solving. But what amazed her most wasn't her own transformation, or even the transformation of the organizations and communities she had helped. What amazed her was the discovery that the capacity for authentic communication and genuine collaboration existed everywhere, in every culture, in every organization, in every community. It just needed to be recognized, supported, and given space to flourish. The little girl who had once helped neighbors understand each other across language barriers had grown into a young woman who was helping nations understand each other across cultural differences. But the fundamental work remained the same: creating bridges between different worlds, one conversation at a time. Sophia looked out her window at the bustling streets of New York, where millions of people from hundreds of countries were navigating the daily challenges of living and working together across countless differences. Somewhere in those streets, she knew, other children were discovering their own gifts for building understanding between different perspectives. And somewhere, she hoped, Another 12-year-old was learning that the most important solutions often came from the most unexpected places, spoken in languages that leaders had never learned to hear. The elevator had been fixed long ago, but the work of helping people truly listen to each other would continue for the rest of her life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.